How to Restore a Tube Radio by Isabel Mejia. So over the summer, I picked up a 1956 Emerson 824 AM radio from an antique shop for $15, which was not working, and I decided to restore it. So before I get into the restoration project, we need some background information on how it actually works. So the basic components are the vacuum tubes, capacitors, resistors, speakers, or one speaker in my case, an antenna, a variable tuning capacitor, and a rectifier. So let's get more in depth for what these components actually do and their purpose in the radio. So basically what a vacuum tube is it heats up and boils electrons into a vacuum, which then absorbs and amplifies an AC current, which is similar to a modern day transistor in terms of what it does, but we do not use vacuum tubes in modern day electronics anymore. So what a rectifier does is it converts AC current into DC current, which smooths out the sound, and most of the components in the radio use DC current, so without it, it wouldn't work at all. And to find it in a radio, it usually has a model number starting with a 5 labeled onto the tube because some of them can look pretty similar to vacuum tubes, but you obviously don't want to get those too confused. So what a variable tuning capacitor does is it changes through frequencies, so aka it tunes through the stations. So a variable tuning resistor or a potentiometer controls the volume of a speaker by limiting or increasing the voltage output. A speaker is pretty straightforward, like you should know what that is. If you don't know what that is, then I can't help you. Capacitors store electrical energy, so the purpose of it in a radio is to control like the amount of hum that a radio has, because without the capacitors, it's just really a lot of electrical noise that comes out instead. And resistors are a staple in any electronic circuit, pretty much. So let's get into the actual restoring project. First off, I had to take off the back cover, which just was inserted by 4 screws and the power plug. And I would recommend making a diagram of where the screws are so you don't lose them. And I just taped them to a piece of paper that said where they went to because there was multiple screws and bolts that were different sizes. And right off the bat, you can see it's quite dirty with some cobwebs and some spider webs in there. There was a dead spider as well. But for the age of the radio, it was actually in very, very good condition. This radio actually has a built-in clock, which is an alarm clock. So the chassis was connected to the clock, which I didn't need to get out the clock, so I left the clock in there because it was working and there was no reason for me to take it out. So I had to unsolder some wires that were connected to there because the power switch was connected to the clock, which was connected to the chassis. So I took out the chassis and then I looked at the components, and the first thing I checked was the tubes to make sure none of them were broken or cracked or anything wrong with them, which usually they don't break, but sometimes just by rough handling they can get cracked. And in my case, none of them were broken. Then I went straight to the capacitors because what I read was capacitors always go bad because they use paper capacitors, which do not have a very long lifespan. So you can tell if a capacitor is bad just by if it's leaking, which in my case nothing was leaking, luckily, or if it's like bubbled out, or if there's anything just deformed on it. So I started with unsoldering them and then taking a picture of their capacitance ratings so I could find replacement parts online. And then after doing that, I went to Google for like 15 minutes and ordered parts and found there's a lot of websites that sell just capacitors and electronics parts. It's pretty straightforward. After I got everything removed that needed to be removed and I ordered all my parts, then I went ahead and I took it outside and I used a can of air that you just use like clean computer parts or like your keyboard, and I started getting out the dirt that was just sitting in like small areas, and I also used a soft bristle brush to make that easier for myself. And then since the outside of the radio was just plastic and it had quite a lot of dirt and stuff on it, like staining. I used dish soap with lukewarm water and a damp towel, and I just started scrubbing on it. And then later on, I used a toothbrush that was clean, and I scrubbed that really well. And I recommend the toothbrush because that worked a lot better than the wet rag did. Then I put the chassis back in the case, and I had to solder the wires back together, which took a good half an hour. It was not easy. And then after I got that all done, I just screwed the back in and reconnected the power cord without putting in the back panel just to test to make sure it actually worked, and it did work. And then I put the back panel back on, and then that was it. It was really straightforward. So, yeah. And here's just some video of it working, and that was it. So, hopefully, you learned something or like got something out of this, and thank you for watching.
Comment a bit odd.
Well, you just told me that. This is the first I've heard of it. So it's.
La ruta es ahora Hispanic Legal Center con el abogado.
Different ways to play the teams, not only twice a year, but every season.